Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered to Abraham, Hear us, my lord, you are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land.
Good morning. It's wonderful that we can be together today and that we can just give God our praise, and all glory is due Him. We're thankful for your presence this morning, especially if you are our guest here. We are so thankful that you have come our way. We have been studying in a series on Abraham, and believe it or not, we are getting really close to wrapping that series up. We've got one more next week in this series as we are looking at his life and how he went about things, how his faith changed over time. And we are going to continue looking at that today. You know, we plan around a lot of things. We plan for our families, we plan for our careers, we plan for schedules and for our retirements. We plan for a lot of different things. One thing that we don't plan for, or maybe we don't plan around, is death. That's just not something that we plan. Usually, death remains unnamed until it barges in our life. And then it becomes not an idea, but then it becomes a person that we loved, an empty chair, a voice we'll never hear again, a future that is different because that person is no longer there. And that's where we come to Genesis chapter 23. Last time we were in Genesis 22, where Abraham takes Isaac up onto the mountain, and he's called to sacrifice his son, and God gives that substitution, and we see such great faith in Abraham there. In Genesis chapter 23, we're fast-forwarding in his life. And now the father of promise is faced with death. And the woman who has been with him through it all, the woman who has borne him the child of promise, the woman whose laughter became a testimony of impossible grace, she's now gone. Sarah dies before the story reaches fulfillment. And Abraham has the child of promise and the assurance of God's blessing. He has a promise big enough to bless the nations, but not yet enough land to bury his wife. And so how does faith respond when death enters before the promise is fulfilled? Faith is not being asked to explain death away, nor does it pretend that grief and loss don't hurt. But faith is being asked to stand beside the grave and still trust the God who promised life. So Genesis 23 begins where faith often begins, not with answers, but in grief. And so we want to look at that this morning. So we think about the grief and the grieving faith. We begin with the text, and it tells us that Sarah lived for 127 years. That's not just background information that it's giving to us there. Sarah's death lands in the middle of the promise. And she has been on this journey with Abraham since the beginning. Just by a show of hands in here, how many people are nearing 50 years of marriage? Let's go a little bit further. Anybody nearing 55? 60 years of marriage? Abraham and Sarah, I'm not saying they have been together that long, but their journey, the point at which Abraham was called when he was 75 years old, to the point in which she dies, 62 years they've been together. They've been together through the waiting, the barrenness, the laughter, the joy of recognizing they have a son. And through all of that, she has carried the promise with Abraham. And so it's natural that the text would tell us that he mourns and weeps and then rises. In the ancient world, when those would pass away, they would have a period of mourning. Depending on the cultures, sometimes it would be 7 days, sometimes it would be 30 days. And you would change what you would wear, you would change what you ate during those times. And the father of promise cries. He's seen God provide. He's walked up and down the land of promise, but that does not keep him immune from sorrow. You see, faith doesn't make grief disappear. It teaches us how to grieve before God. Faith doesn't require that Abraham pretend that the loss is small, but stand beside the body of someone he loved and to cry. And then Abraham rises and he takes the next faithful step while grief is still in his presence. He rises because Sarah's body must be buried. Sarah must be honored. And so he acts faithfully in a world where the promise has not been finished yet. You see, there is a difference between moving forward and moving on. Faith does not rush past the sorrow. I think sometimes there are phrases that we say, and I don't want to say that they're cliche, but I think we use those phrases sometimes when people are mourning loss because we don't know what else to say. We say, well, God's still sovereign. Or that person's in a better place, which are all true. But sometimes that can give us the feeling like, well, I just need to keep moving on. And that's not what faith does. Faith keeps us moving forward while still recognizing the pain and loss that we feel. It recognizes that Yahweh is still working and He is in control, and even that in His presence we can grieve and still take the next faithful step. So that's what Abraham does. He goes forward and he names his unresolved position as he talks with the men of the land. He actually uses two words to describe himself there. The first word is the Hebrew word ger, which means a foreigner without property or deep roots. He says, I've come into this land, but I don't have anything of connection. But he also goes on and he uses the Hebrew word toshav, which means he's a long-term settler who lives among the citizens. The way we might say it, he is the resident foreigner. And that's the tension with Abraham throughout much of his life. is that he is in the land that God promised, but he does not possess the land. He's living between what God has said and what he currently sees. Sarah dies in the land of promise. But Abraham has no place to bury her, and so he goes to the men of the land. Depending on your translation, it may say the sons of Heth, or they are the Hittites. They are the descendants from Ham. And I want you to notice the contrast there when he talks with them. He sees himself as the stranger, the resident foreigner. But when he speaks to them, they recognize him as the Prince of God, the Prince of Elohim. Keep in mind, Sarah's name meant princess. And here he's being called the Prince of Elohim. They recognize the weight of his life. He is displaying Elohim to them as he asks for a burial place for Sarah in the very land that God promises. But let's look forward to this idea then of tangible faith. And if we pick up the reading then in verse 7, it says, Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. And he said to them, if you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burial place. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. And Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went in at the city gate, no, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land. And he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, but if you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, my lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver? What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham listened to Ephron. And Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites before all who went in at the gate of his city. So Abraham secures a burial place for Sarah. But did you notice there's a whole lot being said? There's a whole lot of repetition there. I could have probably said what Abraham did in about one sentence. Abraham went to the Hittites, asked for a burial place, and said, I'll pay you full price, and he paid 400 shekels. There you go. Why does the text slow us down from verse 7 to verse 18? It is like, wow. Okay, it seems that there's this repetitive nature over and over and over again. That Abraham's saying, I want a burial place. Will you please give it to me? They say, yeah, sure, take whatever you want. We're not gonna hold you back in any way. Whatever you want, you can have it. He says, okay, well, can I have the field at Machpelah? They say, yeah, sure. Just take it. But it's Ephraim's, and so Ephraim is there saying, yeah, sure, just take it. And what Abraham is saying is like, no, I don't want to just take it. I want to buy it. The text makes a special note of this transaction, that it is done publicly, that it is done legally, so that there is without question that he owns this piece of land. Think about in the past with Abraham. He's worked out of fear. He's worked out of self-protection. He didn't handle the promise well. But here he doesn't manipulate. He doesn't deceive. He doesn't take any shortcuts. He pays the full price out in the open so that all of these witnesses will see and hear and know that this is his. There's no bargaining. There's no complaining. It is just trust in God. And so the first piece of promised land is a grave. Think about that. The very first piece that is Abraham's possession is not a city. It's not a palace. It's not a vineyard. It's a grave. God fulfilling his promise doesn't come in this victorious conquest with Abraham standing over his enemies. God fulfilling his promise comes while he's standing over the body of his wife. You see, it is hope in the middle of grief. That Sarah is buried in the land that God promised, which means that her death is real, but it is not outside the covenant story. That her death acts as a witness that death is in the story, but it has not ended the promise. What we see is Abraham's possession in the land is an echo of Eden. Notice again how the text describes things. It doesn't just say, yeah, he's got a cave that he buries his wife in. It talks about the cave, it talks about the field, it talks about the trees in the field, it talks about the border. All of this, the authors are trying to get us to see something. We've talked about this earlier when we talked about Lot and after he flees from Sodom. But the idea of the cave, the word cave in Hebrew, its root is the idea of exposure, or what we would say is nakedness. And then when you add with that, it is the cave of Machpelah. Machpelah means pairing or doubling. So what we have is, we could say it's the cave of the naked pair. You say, okay, well, where have we heard about a naked pair before? Well, it takes us back to the very beginning of Genesis. If we go further with that, we see that this place where it actually is it faced Mamre, which we've heard about in the story before. It was in Hebron, which was on a hill, and there were trees around it, sacred oaks that were around this. It is the place where God comes and he meets with Abraham multiple times in his life. This is going to be the place not only where Sarah is buried, but where Abraham will be buried. Where Rebekah and Isaac are going to be buried. Where Leah and Jacob are going to be buried. And here's what the authors want us to see. Eden was a place where eternal life was given. But outside of Eden, there was death. But what we have is this first generation of the blessed ones, the ones who had the Eden blessing to the whole world. They end up in an Eden-like place in their death. That this is not the Eden restored, but it is a small signpost of the Eden that is hoped for. Sarah's body returns to the ground. That's what we're told in Genesis 3, that we all will return to the ground as dust. But Abraham makes sure that that ground is marked by promise. What are we to see in this for ourselves? Faith becomes tangible when we act in the present based off of the future that God has promised. Abraham doesn't own the whole land. Sarah is gone, but he takes the next faithful step. He secures a burial place in the land that God has promised. He doesn't demand, he doesn't manipulate, he doesn't take shortcuts. In humility, he trusts God and what he's promised. So where does our faith need to become visible? Where do we need to take the next faithful step, even when the story, our story, feels unfinished? You see, Genesis 23 ends with Sarah being laid in the ground of promise. And in that quiet act, it begins to point beyond the act itself. It begins to point towards the hope that death will not have the final word. And so we look at the idea of future hope. And in verse 19 again it says, after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. Notice, Sarah dies before the promise is complete. She is not buried outside the promise. You see, this chapter is not just about death, it's where death is placed. Death is placed inside the geography of God's promise, which means death is placed inside hope. Because Sarah's burial shows us the seed of biblical hope. The Hebrew writer reflects upon the whole story of Abraham and Sarah. And in Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about all of the things that they have done through faith. And in verse 13 it says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared for them a city. The text tells us here that Sarah and Abraham lived as people who were looking beyond what they could see. They knew there was something more than just right here and now. And they died in faith, not having received the fullness of what was promised. And so as we look at Genesis 23, what we see is it doesn't paint for us the full light of resurrection, but it teaches us that death cannot stand outside God's promises. Sarah's body is placed in the ground marked by God's covenant future. But as the story develops and hope becomes something bigger and bigger, it goes beyond this burial place of the family. And it becomes a gospel hope. As we look into the New Testament, we see this idea of Abraham being gathered to Abraham and welcomed into paradise. Jesus uses this terminology in Luke chapter 16 when he talks about a poor man and a rich man. And he says in Luke 16, verse 22, he's talking about this poor man, Lazarus. He says, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side or bosom, depending on your translation. The rich man also died and was buried. And the question is, why does Jesus use this? Why is it not that they were taken and they were brought to Adam's side or Noah's side? Why is it Abraham? And the idea is that there is this connection and this intimacy with the idea of coming alongside someone. And it's Abraham who is the father of promise. He's called later the friend of God. And the idea is that the hope of those who transition from this life to something else are tied to the very promise that was made to Abraham. That there is something more than just this life. If we go further in the book of Luke, we see while Jesus is on the cross, there are the two thieves, they're beside him. Both of them start heckling him and casting insults at him, but one thief, as the day goes on, realizes more and more of who he is. And the thief says, "Remember me when you come in your kingdom." And in Luke 23 and verse 43, Jesus says to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." That Greek word is actually the word for garden. So really what we could say in the way in which Jesus is saying this, today you will be with me in Eden. The very place where life with God is restored. The place where heaven and earth overlap. The place where the spiritual and the physical are connected to one another. And that really is God's whole purpose. We've been saying this throughout the past couple of weeks in our Ephesians class and now in the discipleship class. This is God's purpose that is told to us in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. Speaking here of the Father made known to us the mystery of His will according to His good pleasure, which He purposed in Christ, to be put into effect when the times reach their fulfillment, to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. That's His purpose, is to reunite all of heaven and earth together. And so Jesus comes to the grave. He dies and is buried. And for that short period of time, it looks like everything has been lost. The promise is gone. But on the third day, He rose and the grave was opened. Jesus conquers death and opens the way to paradise for us, to the garden, so that resurrection is ours, so that new creation is who we are, so that we have life with God. You see, what begins as a grave in promised ground becomes in Jesus the promise of restored paradise. And if we were to go to the end of our Bibles, to the book of Revelation, that's where everything comes full circle. Because there God is dwelling with His people. There's no more night, there's no more pain, there's no more sin. And there He's dwelling with them beside the tree of life in a renewed garden. So Genesis 23 reminds us that yes, death is real. Death is something that we all have to face and struggle with. But our hope in Jesus is that that's not the end. Our hope is that Jesus has been in the grave, and He has risen from the grave, and that He will take those who are His through the grave into life everlasting with Him. That is our hope. And this morning, that's the invitation to you and to me. Do you have that hope? Can you say without a shadow of a doubt, if I were to die right now, I know I'm going to be with Jesus? That's the assurance that Jesus gives to those who are His. Just as sure as the ground that you're standing on, you can know what happens after this life. Not all of the details, but you know where you are going because of that hope. Do you have that kind of hope this morning? That's the invitation that Jesus gives to you, to all of us. Do you hold on to that hope? It's easy to let the cares of this world pull us away from what truly is meaningful and valuable. Maybe you're here this morning, you're just struggling. You're saying, look, I've got all sorts of problems in my life. And this world will have problems. But Jesus shows us the way through those problems. If you're drifting away from Him, come back to Him. Don't let this world be the thing that holds you back. That's His invitation this morning. If we can help you in any way, won't you come as together we stand and sing.